I knew the HOA was bold, but I never expected them to march onto my property, point at the lake behind my home, and claim it as theirs. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that I had been quietly holding a secret that would blow their entire plan apart. And the moment they stepped onto those docks, they unknowingly crossed into territory I owned completely. That day started like any other quiet morning, coffee in hand, watching mist roll off the water. But then I saw them, 3 HOA board members, storming down the path with clipboards like they were leading a military operation. At the front was Linda, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, wearing that sharp, impatient glare that meant trouble for anyone in her way. She didn't bother knocking. She didn't even bother greeting me. She simply jabbed her finger toward the shoreline and announced, "We need access to our lake. And your docks are now under HOA jurisdiction." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. They spoke with so much confidence, so much authority, as if a declaration from them magically rewrote property law. But I played along. I asked questions. I let them talk. I let them list their new rules, their new fees, their new mandatory inspections. Every word they threw at me only dug their hole deeper. Then Linda stepped onto the dock. And right behind her, the other 2 followed. I watched the boards shift under their weight, and I felt the moment finally arrive. They thought they were claiming power. They thought they were taking control. In reality, they were standing on evidence. "Before you go any further," I said slowly, "you should know something." They turned, annoyed, impatient, ready to dismiss me again. That's when I dropped the truth: this dock and every dock on this entire shoreline is mine. I own them. Not the HOA. Not the neighborhood. Me. For the first time all morning, they froze. Their faces drained. Clipboards lowered. The sudden silence was almost satisfying. I pulled out the folder I'd been saving for months: surveys, deeds, water access agreements, everything the HOA never bothered to research. And when I opened it, I saw panic flicker in Linda's eyes. She realized she hadn't just stepped onto a dock, she'd stepped onto a legal trap she couldn't escape. Their silence stretched, thick and uneasy, as they realized the ground beneath them literally and legally was never theirs to claim. The lake had been privately parceled long before the HOA existed, and the previous owner had transferred every access right to me alone. They hadn't just overstepped, they had wandered straight into a legal ambush. And the real fight was still ahead of us. The HOA board stood frozen on my dock, stunned into a silence I had never seen from them before. But shock quickly turned to anger, especially from Linda. Her jaw tightened, and she stepped closer like she still had some authority to pull from thin air. "This doesn't change anything," she snapped. "The HOA governs all shared community resources, including this lake." "No," I replied calmly, opening the folder wider so they could see the highlighted sections. "This lake is not a shared resource. It's privately parceled land. These docks? Privately constructed. Access rights? Privately held. And the easement you keep referring to?" I tapped the page. "Terminated 23 years ago." I could see the moment her confidence cracked. The other 2 board members leaned in, reading the documents with growing panic. They whispered among themselves, trying to piece together a counterargument, but the truth was ironclad. The HOA had built their entire power play on assumptions and bluffs, nothing more. But instead of backing down, Linda doubled down. She straightened her clipboard, lifted her chin, and said, "We can challenge these documents. The HOA legal team." I cut her off. "Your legal team is one retired attorney who volunteers twice a year. Meanwhile, I've already consulted actual property lawyers who specialize in land rights and water access. If you want to take this to court, I'm more than prepared." Her glare sharpened, but behind it I saw fear. She tried one last angle. "The community expects access to this lake. You can't just block everyone out. I'm not blocking anyone out, I said. I'm blocking you out. I'm blocking power-hungry board members who think rules apply to everyone except themselves. There was a long moment where no one spoke. The breeze pushed ripples across the water. The dock creaked beneath their feet, the same dock they had assumed belonged to them just minutes earlier. Now it felt like contested territory under their shoes. Finally, one of the other board members, the quieter one, Mark, let out a defeated sigh. Linda, he's right. We should have checked the records. Her head snapped toward him, furious, but he didn't flinch. He was done being dragged into bad decisions. I stepped closer. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to climb off my dock, walk back to the HOA office, and rewrite your notice. No threats. No fake rules. No claims of ownership. Because next time you try to overreach, I won't just pull out paperwork, I'll file a complaint with the county. Linda's face flushed red. But there was nothing she could do. She turned sharply and marched away, the other two following in embarrassed silence. But I knew this wasn't over. It was only the beginning. Over the next few days, the neighborhood buzzed with rumors. People whispered at mailboxes, slowed their cars when passing my house, and kept trying to piece together what really happened on the dock. Clearly, Linda hadn't told them the truth. Instead, she'd twisted the story into some bizarre version where I was the villain stealing access from the community. But the residents weren't fools. They'd lived here long enough to know the HOA's reputation. And when a few curious neighbors approached me directly, I decided it was time to share some facts, not drama, not accusations, just the real, documented truth. I invited them to my backyard, laid out the same folder I showed the board, and walked them through everything calmly. Maps, land surveys, easements, property lines, it was all there. By the time I finished, most of them were shaking their heads, stunned that the HOA had launched such a bold accusation without doing even basic research. One neighbor, Mr. Dawson, spoke quietly. We've all felt bullied by the HOA for years. Maybe this is what finally exposes them. I agreed. But as the group began to leave, something unexpected happened. A woman named Evelyn stayed behind. She hesitated before speaking. I need to tell you something, she said. Last night, Linda held an emergency HOA meeting. She told everyone she plans to push a lake access vote. Said she'll force compliance if she has to. Force compliance. That phrase echoed in my mind. It wasn't just stubbornness anymore, this was a full-on power grab. I thanked Evelyn, and after she left, I sat on the dock, staring out at the water. I'd hoped exposing the truth would shut the HOA down, but instead, it only provoked them. If they wanted a fight, they were about to learn I wasn't someone who backed down when pushed. The next morning, before the sun even fully rose, I heard footsteps on the gravel path. Several shadows appeared, Linda and two new board members. They weren't storming in this time. They weren't shouting. They weren't waving clipboards. They were marching with purpose. Linda didn't waste a second. You're interfering with HOA operations, she said. We're giving you a final opportunity to comply before we escalate this formally. I met her cold stare. You can escalate all you want. But unless you've suddenly acquired property rights you don't have, you're wasting your time. Her lips curled into a smirk. We'll see about that. And for the first time, she handed me a document instead of waving one. A thick packet, stapled and stamped. It wasn't a violation notice. It wasn't a warning. It was something far more serious. A lawsuit. The HOA was officially coming after me. The lawsuit packet felt heavier than it should have, thick, overstuffed, and designed to intimidate. Linda stood there watching me, arms folded, clearly expecting me to panic, crack, or beg for a compromise. But instead of fear, I felt something else rise in me, determination. They had finally crossed a line from nuisance into full-scale aggression, and that meant it was time to finish this once and for all. I calmly flipped through the pages. Even at a glance, I could see the flaws. The HOA had filed a claim asserting community rights over the lake, accusing me of obstructing shared access, and demanding a court order to seize control of every dock. They were hoping legal jargon would overshadow the truth. They were hoping a judge wouldn't look too closely. They were hoping I'd fold before things got serious. Bad news for them. I had been preparing for this possibility for months. I looked up at Linda. "Did your attorney actually write this?" I asked, "or did you draft it yourselves and hope no one would notice?" Her face twitched, just for a second. "It's a legitimate claim," she insisted. "You can't stop what's coming." I smiled. "Oh, I'm not stopping anything. I'm responding. Officially." That same afternoon, I contacted my property attorney, sent him copies of the documents, and scheduled a meeting. When we sat down the next day, he schemed through the HOA's claim and actually laughed out loud. "This case won't last 5 minutes, he said. "They have no jurisdiction, no standing, and no authority to seize private water access. This isn't a lawsuit, it's a tantrum." We drafted a counterclaim not just to get the case dismissed, but to pursue damages for harassment, attempted property seizure, and abuse of authority. If the HOA wanted a war, they were about to feel the full consequences of starting one. 2 weeks later, the hearing came. The courtroom was small, quiet, and far less dramatic than Linda had probably imagined. She sat at the front with her board members, clutching their folders like weapons. I sat beside my attorney, calm and ready. When the judge reviewed the documents, everything unraveled instantly. The land surveys, deed history, easement termination forms, every piece of evidence showed I had complete and uncontested ownership of the docks. The HOA had no claim, no rights, and no legal ground beneath them. The judge looked over his glasses at Linda. "Ma'am, not only is this lawsuit dismissed with prejudice, but I'm ordering the HOA to pay the defendant's legal fees. Consider this a warning, do not file baseless claims again." The color drained from her face. It was over. The lake was mine, the docks were mine, and the HOA's reign of intimidation had finally collapsed. When I stepped outside the courthouse, the cool air felt like victory. Victory in court should have been the end of it. The judge's ruling was clear, the HOA was humiliated, and the neighborhood finally understood the truth about the lake and the docks. But sometimes, when people lose power, they don't accept defeat quietly, they double down in new, unexpected ways. And that was exactly what happened next. 3 days after the verdict, I woke up to something strange. Half the neighborhood gathered near the shoreline, murmuring and staring at the water. I threw on a jacket, stepped outside, and immediately saw why. Someone likely acting on HOA orders had posted massive wooden signs around the lake reading, "Caution, unsafe water. Do not enter. Hazardous conditions, swimming and boating prohibited." The problem? There was nothing unsafe about the water. It had been tested regularly. It was clean, stable, and perfectly healthy. The signs were nothing more than a desperate attempt to scare people away from the shoreline, an effort to regain psychological control after losing legal control. I walked over to the crowd. People were whispering nervously, unsure what to believe. A few parents were already pulling their kids away from the lake. Fear spreads quickly when uncertainty feeds it. That's when I noticed Linda standing at the back of the group, arms crossed, wearing a smug little smile. She thought she'd found a loophole. She couldn't own the lake. She couldn't own the docks. She couldn't win in court. But she could still manipulate fear. I stepped forward and raised my voice enough for the crowd to hear. "Those signs are fake," I said. "They're illegal, they weren't placed by the county, and the HOA has zero authority to declare the lake unsafe." People looked at me, then back at the signs, torn between fear and reason. I lifted my phone. Would you like to hear something interesting? I opened the county water quality report, downloaded straight from the official website. The lake passed every test last month with excellent ratings. There's no contamination. No hazards. No restrictions. The tension in the crowd shifted into confusion, then frustration. One neighbor marched straight to a sign and smacked it with the back of his hand. So the HOA lied again. I didn't even have to answer. The look on Linda's face said everything. I approached her directly. This ends now, I said quietly. No more lies. No more scare tactics. If you keep pushing this, I'll file additional complaints, and this time, they won't be civil matters. Posting fraudulent hazard signs is a criminal offense. Her smirk finally vanished. That afternoon, under pressure from angry residents, the HOA was forced to remove every sign. A neighborhood vote soon followed, and for the first time in years, the majority spoke loud and clear. Linda was removed from the HOA board. The lake was peaceful again. The docks were safe. With Linda removed from power, the neighborhood finally began breathing normally again. People walked by the lake without glancing over their shoulders. Kids played near the docks without worry. And for the first time since moving here, the community actually felt like a community, relaxed, friendly, and free from the constant tension that had hung over us for years. But peace, as I was about to learn, doesn't rebuild itself. It needed direction. It needed structure. It needed someone who understood both the importance of property rights and the value of keeping the community united. So when several neighbors approached me one evening with a surprising request, I had no idea how much everything was about to change. A small group knocked on my door: Evelyn, Mr. Dawson, and a couple of others who had stood by me through the chaos. They weren't angry, they weren't afraid, they looked hopeful. "We want you to help fix the HOA," Evelyn said. "Not lead it, just help straighten it out." I raised an eyebrow. "You're asking the guy who just fought the HOA in court to help run it?" "That's exactly why," Mr. Dawson replied. "You understand boundaries. You understand fairness. And you're not afraid to stand up to abuse of power." I laughed softly, half in disbelief. The idea of being involved with the very organization that had caused me so much trouble felt ironic. But the truth was undeniable: the HOA wasn't the enemy. The people abusing its authority were. And now that those people were gone, maybe it was time to rebuild instead of resent. I agreed to attend the next meeting not as a board member, but as an advisor, someone who could help rewrite rules and restore trust. The room that night felt oddly tense at first, but when I walked in, people actually applauded. Not because I'd won anything, but because I'd stood up for what was right. We spent hours drafting new guidelines, limits on board authority, transparency requirements, mandatory community votes for major decisions, and protections that prevented exactly what Linda had tried to do. By the end of the meeting, the HOA actually looked like something it was supposed to be: a community organization, not a dictatorship. When I walked home under the quiet glow of porch lights, the lake shimmered in the moonlight. The same lake they tried to take. The same docks they had marched onto without knowing they were standing on my property. The same water that had sparked an entire neighborhood revolution. But now, it wasn't a battleground. It was a symbol of balance. A symbol of what happens when people stand together instead of against each other. And as I stood at the edge of the dock, feeling the board steady beneath my feet, one thing became undeniably clear. Sometimes the fight you never wanted becomes the victory your whole community needed. If you'd like, I can continue with Chapter 7 or generate the full combined 6-chapter script in one file. Weeks passed, and the calm that settled over the neighborhood felt almost unreal. No surprise notices taped to doors. No angry emails. No board members marching around like self-appointed sheriffs. Instead, people were finally enjoying their homes without fear of petty enforcement. But as peaceful as things were, Something unexpected started happening, something I never anticipated. Neighbors began treating the lake differently. Not as a battleground. Not as a symbol of HOA control. But as a shared treasure. Families held picnics by the shoreline. Kids fished from the docks. Even the older residents began taking morning walks along the path, chatting with each other instead of glaring past one another. The lake had gone from a point of tension to a point of connection, and, strangely, they began to see me as its unofficial guardian. One evening, as the sun was melting into the horizon, Evelyn showed up again, this time with a folder. I couldn't help but laugh when I saw it. I swear, I joked, if that's another lawsuit. It's the opposite, she interrupted with a smile. We want to create a lake stewardship committee, and we want you to lead it. I blinked. What? She opened the folder and handed me a neatly typed proposal. Not an HOA role, she clarified. Not a governing board. Just a small volunteer group to protect the shoreline, maintain the docks, organize cleanup days, and ensure no one ever tries to seize control of the lake again. I scanned the pages. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about authority. It was about preservation, about making sure the lake stayed what it was meant to be, a peaceful escape, not a point of conflict. For the first time in a long while, the idea genuinely warmed my heart. I'll do it, I said. But only if the committee is open to everyone. No politics. No favoritism. Just people who love the lake. Evelyn grinned. That's exactly what we want. Over the next week, we formed the committee. More people signed up than we expected, dozens, from all corners of the neighborhood. Together, we installed new benches, fixed loose planks on the docks, planted native shrubs to prevent erosion, and even set up a small community board with lake updates and event announcements. Ironically, the same docks that once sparked a bitter war were now bringing people together. One afternoon, while tightening bolts on one of the railings, Mr. Dawson approached me with a thoughtful expression. You know, he said, if the HOA had respected boundaries from the beginning, none of this would have happened. I tightened the last bolt and stood up. True. But maybe the chaos was necessary. Sometimes you need a storm to remind people what peace looks like. He nodded slowly. And sometimes, he added, you need someone willing to stand their ground so others can find theirs. I glanced out over the shimmering water, feeling a deep sense of calm settle in. The lake was safe. The community was stronger. And the docks, my docks, were no longer symbols of conflict but anchors of unity. Not long after the Lake Stewardship Committee settled into its rhythm, the community began to flourish in ways no one had expected. Events formed naturally: sunset gatherings, fishing mornings, even small weekend barbecues near the shoreline. What used to be a place avoided out of fear of HOA confrontation had become the neighborhood's favorite escape. But just as things were reaching a peaceful normal, an unexpected letter arrived in my mailbox. Not from the HOA. Not from a neighbor. But from the County Land Records Office. At first, I thought it was routine paperwork. But when I opened it, my chest tightened. Inside was a notice that a developer, a name I didn't recognize, had requested information about parcels surrounding the lake. Developers don't request information for fun. They request it because they see opportunity. And I knew exactly what kind of opportunity they saw: expensive lakefront real estate, ripe for expansion, if ownership could be untangled. That evening, I called an emergency committee meeting. When everyone gathered around the dock, their faces lit by the soft glow of lanterns, I held up the notice. We may have a bigger problem coming, I said. Evelyn frowned. You think they want to buy land around the lake? Not just buy, I replied. Developers reshape entire neighborhoods. If they think this lake is an untapped resource, they'll try to use it. The group exchanged uneasy looks. The HOA drama had been exhausting. No one wanted a new fight, especially one with a corporate entity backed by deep pockets. Mr. Dawson spoke first. Do they have any legal claim? Not to the docks, I said. Those are mine. But the surrounding areas. They might start buying property. And if they gain enough influence, they could pressure the community or worse, the county to approve lakeside projects. Silence settled in. Then Evelyn stepped forward. So we get ahead of it, she said firmly. We show them this community isn't for sale. Her words lit a spark. Within days, the committee transformed into a coordinated grassroots force. We organized a petition to secure the lake as a protected natural space. We pushed for an environmental assessment to classify it as a conservation area, making development nearly impossible. Residents who once avoided any kind of HOA politics now showed up with passion, signing documents, attending town meetings, and speaking out. And then something incredible happened. The developer sent an official letter to the community. We are withdrawing our inquiry. It is clear the residents value the natural state of this lake, and we respect that. Just like that, the threat evaporated. On the night we received the news, the entire neighborhood gathered by the water. Lanterns hung from trees, kids ran along the shoreline, and a sense of unity pulsed through the air. As I stood at the edge of my dock, the cool breeze brushing across the surface of the lake, I realized something profound. The lake wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to all of us, not by law, but by heart. By effort. By community. By the battles we had fought together. The developer withdrew. The sense of triumph in the neighborhood was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't just relief, it was pride. People who once kept to themselves were now waving at each other from porches, stopping to chat on evening walks, and meeting up at the lake just to enjoy the peace we had all fought to protect. But as the excitement settled, a new challenge quietly crept into view, one that had nothing to do with HOAs, lawsuits, or developers. This time, the threat came from nature itself. It started with something small, a neighbor mentioning that the water level seemed slightly lower than usual. At first, I brushed it off, seasonal changes were normal. But over the next week, 3 more residents mentioned it. Curious, I checked the water line markings on my dock posts. They were right. The lake was dropping. At first, it was just a few inches. But days later, it had sunk even farther. During our next committee meeting, concern hung heavy in the air. Evelyn brought photos she'd taken along the shoreline, patches of exposed earth where water usually touched. Mr. Dawson, who'd lived there the longest, shook his head with a grim expression. In 30 years, he said, I've never seen it drop this fast. The question wasn't if something was wrong. It was why. The committee decided to investigate. We split into teams, some checked the inlets, others inspected the surrounding land. I took a small group to the far side of the lake where the natural drainage path sat. When we got there, my stomach dropped. A wide trench freshly dug snaked along the woods, diverting water away from the lake. Someone had rerouted a natural water feeder. This looks intentional, one neighbor muttered. It is intentional, I replied. Fresh shovel marks. New tire tracks. A path cut through underbrush that had been untouched for years. Someone had created a drainage channel large enough to redirect thousands of gallons. But who? We followed the trench, careful not to disturb evidence. After about 20 minutes, it led us straight to the edge of a property bordering the far woods, a property owned by a man named Carter. A quiet, reclusive guy who rarely attended meetings and kept mostly to himself. Before accusing anyone, we decided to gather more information. The next morning, I spoke with the county's environmental division. They confirmed our worst suspicion: the drainage was unauthorized, illegal, and incredibly damaging. When I mentioned the location, the official sighed. You're not the first neighborhood complaining about him. He's been redirecting water on his land for his personal projects for months. That evening, I called an urgent meeting at the lake. The once peaceful air was filled with tension as I explained everything. The HOA was gone. The developer had backed out. But now a private landowner was draining the lake itself. And this time, the battle wasn't about rights or power. It was about survival for the lake, for the wildlife, and for the entire community built around its shores.